This is November 5th, 2002. This is Linda McMacken with the Muriel Cook Library of Waynesville, Ohio. And today we'll be interviewing Thomas Thacker at the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Good morning. We'd like to take a moment to thank you for coming and participating in the Veterans Oral History Project and taking the time to talk with us.
It's a privilege to me.
Well, we appreciate it very much. I'd like to start off with, if you would, just tell me the branch of service that you were in, what years that you served, and if you served in wartime, what your capacity was during that time.
I got my commission as a second lieutenant in college, and then taught school for 2 years up in northern Michigan. And then, actually, my commission was in field artillery, and so I was quite surprised when I was called to duty with what was at that time the Air Corps for a year under the Selective Service Act. So I reported into Selfridge Field, Michigan on the 2nd of July, 1941. That happened to be the day after the conversion from the Air Corps into the Army Air Forces. Quite a few of us reported in at that time. All of us were ground pounders in various branches. It seems that the Air Corps, when called upon to train some 50,000 cadets a year to make pilots out of them, realized that they had to have some non-flying officers to do the groundwork in order to release the pilots for their primary job. And so as they referred to us initially as branch immaterial. And as we came down the line, okay, you're an adjutant, you go over there. You're a supply officer, you go over there. Transportation, mess officer, the whole schmear. And some, like myself, were designated as a supply officer and remained that job for the next 28 years. So I became then a squadron supply officer, 5th Pursuit Squadron it was at that time, 52nd Pursuit Group. A few months later they changed from pursuit to fighter, and I stayed in that same group. I moved up from squadron to headquarters partway through the war, but I went overseas with them in the summer of the following year, just after I was supposed to have been released from active duty, and then the war came along and changed things quite a bit. So I was the squadron supply officer of the 5th Fighter Squadron. As I went overseas, we were, I think either the 2nd or the 3rd fighter group to go over to the European theater. Okay. Actually, we went into, the air echelon went ahead of us, the pilots and a few support troops. And then the bulk of the group followed about a month later. And we went into Scotland at Belfast, and then took another ship across the Irish Sea to Ulster, North Ireland, Belfast, where we spent the next month or so in an RAF base. Okay,
well let me stop you a little bit right here. I wanted to start out and get a little information about your home life at the time. Were you a married man or were you single?
Yes and no, all of the above.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I was single when I was on active duty, although I had a more or less an arrangement with a young lady. And so I kept in touch with her, and in the early spring of 1942, I was living in a tent down in Florence, South Carolina, where we were based. It wasn't particularly a happy arrangement, and almost on an impulse, I wrote her a letter and said, instead of waiting until the war is over to get married, how would you feel about coming down here and doing it now? And her answer was, I'll be down there Wednesday. It wasn't until a little later I looked at the calendar and realized that Wednesday was the 1st of April, but I trusted that she was serious. And she also said in that, alert the chaplain. So I alerted the chaplain, lined up a couple of volunteers as witnesses, a couple of pilots who wouldn't be flying on Saturday, the day before Easter actually. And so we were married in a Methodist church that we borrowed down there. The only people there were myself and my bride, her parents, the two witnesses, the chaplain, and I believe the janitor was there. Oh, I paid $5 to an organist. So that was the whole wedding party. But apparently it was legal because it lasted for 59 and a half years before she passed away. Actually, my date is 9/13. It was 2 days after 9/11. But we had 59 and a half pretty good years.
Oh, wonderful.
And so when I went overseas, I was married.
So where did you, was she allowed to stay there? Did she have to go back home after you
Well,
married?
we didn't stay any place very long.
Mm-hmm.
So I was fortunate enough to rent a house by the week. I think it was $15 a week that it cost us. Very nice little bungalow.
Mm-hmm.
But we were only there about 3 weeks when we moved over to Wilmington, North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that the base where we were was too new, and there was too much sand blowing around, and it was raising hob with the engines. And they were grinding the cylinders where they weren't supposed to grind them.
Yeah.
So we went to Wilmington, and then there's a real curious thing. There was a plan afoot at that time to fly some fighter groups over to British Isles off the wings of B-17s. And there were 2 of them up in New England. Actually, the first fighter group of P-38s up in Maine, and the 31st fighter group with P-39s at Manchester, New Hampshire.
Now, is this actually the plane sitting on the wings? Or how was
Well, they'd fly
explain?
off the wings, and the B-17s would navigate.
Uh-huh.
And I suppose if a plane went down in the ocean, they probably carried a couple of reefs they could toss out because there wasn't much else they could do.
Yeah.
They probably had some emergency equipment they could drop.
Uh-huh.
So those 2 groups had sent their support people overseas already and realized that they were not competent to fly yet, and so they needed some support. So they actually disengaged 2 of our ground echelons, our 2 squadrons, sent one of ours, the 4th Squadron, up to Bangor, Maine, to support the P-38s up there, and my squadron went to Manchester, New Hampshire, to support the P-39 era Cobras.
Mm.
Those happened to be the same planes that our group was flying in the Carolinas. Well, after a period of time, they decided to send the 31st overseas by ship, because the British had offered us some Spitfires. And so they moved off the base, and our group then moved up, and we took over their
Up in Maine?
P-39s at Manchester.
Okay.
And of course, my wife moved along each time that we went.
Okay, so
We-
she was able to do that
Yeah.
then?
Now,
Okay.
when we got to Manchester, we had a real problem of housing. We were able to stay for 3 or 4 days at a country club that offered us shelter, but it looked like she was going to have to head for home. And then some local people, some of the local ladies, very kindly realized the problem that we were having, and they offered their homes to move into. So my wife Peg and I moved in with Peg Blodgett, whose husband was stationed down at Brooklyn, so she was alone with her 2 big dogs. And so all the time we were there, we lived with her, which
How
was a very nice
kind.
arrangement. And then we were scheduled then to go overseas to fly over until somebody evidently decided that this single-engine P-39 really should not be out over the Atlantic Ocean. So they changed the plans. They left them as they were on the P-38s, and they actually made the trip off the wings of the B-17s. And that is how those B-17s and P-38s landed on the ice cap that I'm sure you read about, where they sunk down into the ice, and they recently dug down in and excavated one of the P-38s. But the rest of the group made it overseas, and I think they were probably the first group over. Well, the 31st Fighter Group had already gone over, and they'd been checked out in the Spitfires, the British Spitfires. And then they decided to send our P-39s not to Europe, but up to Alaska, and I think on over to Russia, because the Russians liked them just fine as tank busters to destroy the German tanks.
Okay.
So that was when our air echelon first in one ship, and about a month later, the rest of us celebrated Christmas in July, on the 4th of July, because we knew we wouldn't be in the States come Christmas.
Okay.
Sent our wives home, climbed aboard the SS Monterey, which just a short time ago, within the last couple of months, somebody sent me a clipping that the Monterey is the last troop ship of World War II still in service, and it was just ready to head off somewhere in the Middle East to be scrapped. So I presume now they're tearing it apart, and that's the end of the World War II troop ships. But we were part of the largest convoy up to that time, of between 20 and 25.
Now, what year did you ship out of New York? Is that where you left out of?
Brooklyn, actually. We went up to Halifax.
Now, what year did you ship? What time was this?
Yeah, now this was late July in 1942.
42. Okay.
And at that time, our pilots were checking out in Spitfires up in Ulster near Londonderry.
Right.
So we went to Halifax Harbor first, and picked up some more ships, and then we took off across the ocean, zigzagging. There were near 25 big troop ships. Each one, ours had about 5,000 troops on. We were one of the larger ones. The SS West Point, I think, was the largest, and so the Commodore was on that one.
Now,
right.
Did you have any siblings that were in the service, or were you the only?
Well, not at that time, of course, since my wife went home pregnant, and that one actually ended up in the Air Force.
No, I meant, did you have brothers and sisters?
Oh, did I? Oh, you said siblings. I'm sorry. I thought you said children. Actually, I have 2 brothers and a sister. One brother was a farmer, but also was physically disqualified. The other one, roughly 10 years older than I, joined the Navy before he got drafted. And so he's still in business, actually living in Canada across from Buffalo, New York, 94 years old, but still going strong.
Oh my, wonderful.
In fact, all my siblings are living, 94, 92, and 86.
Wow.
I'm the youngest of the crowd. Seems like none of us know when to go.
And we're very glad. We're glad you're here. When you, after you got to England, was that where the ships all ended up? Did they come into London or Ulster?
They all landed somewhere around the British Isles.
Okay.
Yes, not all at the same place.
Okay.
So we took, as I say, another ship from, well, actually it's the Firth of Clyde, which is just outside Glasgow in Scotland, over to Belfast.
Once you got over there, and you said your missus was pregnant at the time,
yeah.
Was it difficult to communicate back home with her at that time? How was the mail
We were able
service?
to communicate, except that letters were slow in arriving, and of course we were moving around quite a bit, which didn't make it any easier.
Right.
And after about I was in Ireland only about a month. Rained all the time, by the way. They had we could see in Londonderry the barrage balloons, and one day somebody looked at them and it was raining as usual, and he said, "Why don't they cut those ropes and let the island sink?" But
now, what did they use the balloons for?
those are what they call barrage balloons to force enemy aircraft to stay at high altitude. They could not come down low to drop their bombs or strafe.
Oh, because of a balloon?
Because of the barrage balloons, yes.
Okay.
Because these steel cables underneath, and also I think some of them actually hung extra cables.
Okay.
So if they tried to
had
fly,
steel cables. How high up were the balloons?
oh,
Altitude?
they'd be up a couple of thousand feet probably,
Okay.
about as high as a helium balloon without
Okay. I
anybody
didn't
on
realize
board
they were
could
that
conveniently
high.
go.
Okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's essentially the same balloon that was used in, well, it was used first in the Civil War, and then in World War I, with a basket underneath and an observer.
Oh.
So really, the first military aviation were these observation balloons, which became barrage balloons in World War II.
Okay.
They also
Now they had them all around the perimeter of Ireland or around the
no,
coast? Or
over
how
the
did
city,
that-
over the city or
Oh.
over the port.
Okay.
Also, a lot of them were used, for instance, to go through the British Channel. The ships would launch one or two above them to keep keep any low-flying airplanes from coming in,
Okay.
and they were quite effective.
Wow. So I didn't realize that. So where did you go once you landed and you got with your squadron? Where did you end up?
Well, that's a long way to ending up, but
Well, I mean,
yeah,
what was
after
your,
our
and,
pilots
the
became
group that you were assigned to, and what your objective was, and
as soon as our pilots became proficient in the Spitfires, and those were the early Spitfires, the same kind that defended England in the Battle of Britain, the three-bladed, what we call the Mark V Spitfires, which are extremely rare, and the museum was very fortunate to have gotten one of them from, I guess it's the American Museum in Britain, about 6 months ago. So it's here being prepared to put on display as a Spitfire being flown by the Americans. There were only the two American groups that had Spitfires, then there were several individual squadrons. But we continued with those Spitfires for 2 years of the 3 years that we were overseas. So we came back to England and were stationed quite far north, up by Hull on the Humber River. But we began to send small units south in England so that they could start flying fighter sweeps across France. Of course, I never became a pilot, so I was kind of a rear echelon type of individual, but naturally we kept in close contact with them. In fact, we supported them as much as we could.
now you were a supply officer.
So I was all through the war.
What did you supply? What was your daily life like? Your daily job
It was very versatile. But
were you the typical scrounging supply officer we've seen so
I was
much?
going to say, scrounging was a very important part
I'm
of
sure
it.
you've got some good stories about some scrounging.
Yes.
Well, you could give us a few.
Of one's almost getting caught, but not quite.
It's always good, not quite. Would you care to expand on that?
Why don't we wait until we get into North Africa?
Okay, we can do
Because
that.
that's where it happened.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
So our pilots have been flying combat only for a couple of weeks when we got the order to stand down, in other words, quit flying, that we would turn our airplanes back over to the British, and our pilots would take off in some direction to a classified destination where they would pick up new airplanes for a campaign that we would learn about in due time, highly classified. The rest of us would follow very shortly, and we would be separate from our pilots for a period of time. It might run, they didn't know exactly, but probably from 2 weeks to 30 days before we join up with them somewhere. Of course, then we begin speculating, well, where are we going? We don't think we're going to Norway because we didn't get any winter clothes issued. So it probably was south. I know that my guess was Dakar, although I realize there wouldn't have been much point in going to Dakar, as I know the situation better today. But just before our pilots left, they said, now you may have to support your own, maintain your own airplanes for a few days somewhere. So if your supply officer could make up individual kits for you, well, they might be of help. So we provided each one a paper bag, and in it, to support a fighter airplane, we had a little crescent wrench, two different kinds of pliers, some safety wire, some tape, a jackknife, not a very sophisticated toolkit. But they took them, and some of them may have used them, I don't know. Well, supplying of toolkits, for example, was one of my responsibilities, making sure that the mess hall had food, and sometimes that became quite a...
And what kind of food did the mess hall have at that, where you were stationed at that point?
When we were with the Brits, of course, we had steak and kidney pudding and other things. Steak and kidney pudding is not one of my favorites, by the way. Although we did learn to like afternoon tea. I kind of enjoyed that.
Did you?
It's a nice break at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But we were happy to get back to England, where we went on the regular U.S. ration. Although that changed when we got to North Africa.
So you went to North Africa from England?
So that was actually where we were headed.
Okay.
What is known as Operation Torch, the invasion of West Africa, actually Algeria, and then into Tunisia mostly. Well, some of them came into Morocco. It's the 3 countries up there. So our pilots have been gone for, maybe 2 weeks, when on day before Halloween, we climbed aboard a British train and headed to Liverpool, where we got on another ship to Brazil this time. Actually, our 3 squadrons were put on 3 different ships, so that if somebody got sunk, we wouldn't all get sunk. And my squadron went on the Brazil. The Argentina, and I think the 3rd one was British. They were not very happy because British rations are not that great. American rations on those ships were excellent.
And what were they?
Actually, the officers ordered from the menu. We had a new menu every day.
Wow.
So we had a choice of steak or roast beef or fish or
None
whatever.
of the dried stuff, the real food.
Real food.
Real food. Oh,
Very
my.
similar to what it was
So
when
how
I
long
went to Alaska 2 or 3 years ago.
So how long did it take for the ship to get to
Now
Africa?
they used the length of the cruise as a way to bring them into proper order. So the ones that took off first swung over very near New York City, they tell me, before we turned back. We were gone from, it was Halloween evening when we got on board, and we actually docked on the afternoon of what we called Armistice Day in those days, the 11th of November. So it was actually about 11 days that we were on the water, which was about 3 times what it would have taken to go directly to our destination. And it was when we were about 3 days out in the ocean that we found out where we were going, when the president announced that Allied forces have landed in Northwest Africa. So we then knew where we were headed, and we went through the Straits of Gibraltar on the evening of the 7th of November. And we could just barely see Gibraltar over on the left, because everything was blacked out, but we could see the silhouette against the sky. We could see what's over on the other side, Tangiers. All the lights were lit. that was the last time I saw lights lit until the war in Europe ended. From there on, everywhere we went was blacked out. So we had one day then in the Mediterranean, and finally, as I say, on the afternoon of Armistice Day, we docked at Mirs El Kabir, which is the port of Oran.
And what was it like then?
Well, actually, while we were on the water in the Mediterranean, we were standing for our 3 minutes, as was a tradition in those days, 3 minutes of silence at 11 o'clock in the morning. Everybody up on the deck. It was clouded over. It was that time of the year when the rains were about to begin. And suddenly, out of one of those clouds, popped a Messerschmitt, an ME-109, who saw us, and we saw him, and he's probably as scared as we were. Needless to say, the klaxons went off, and the 3 minutes quit right then and there. But we did not have any actual encounter. We were assumed, of course, that he was spotting us for submarines. But we moved into the harbor, and the Allies had just barely taken it. Actually, they'd only taken the harbor the evening before. But if they hadn't, we would have been doing wheelies out in the Mediterranean for maybe a day or so. But we didn't have to do that. So we went in there and spent the night on board the ship. The next morning, I went up on deck, and I looked out over the breakwater, and a convoy of freighters was coming in.
Ours or theirs? Ours or theirs?
They were ours, yeah.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, our vehicles, for instance, were in that convoy. And as I was watching, about a couple of 3 minutes later, there was a boom, and one of them was torpedoed about a mile out from the harbor. And it didn't stay afloat more than 5 minutes. Of course, they were combat loading those vessels at the time, so they had on board vehicles and fuel, gasoline, ammunition. It made a pretty explosive mixture. But that's the only ship that I ever actually saw sink. Fortunately, none of them in the convoys that I was in ever had any serious trouble. Oh, we had a few alerts, and the destroyers dropped a few depth bombs and so on, but we didn't have anything torpedoed. We were, as I say, fortunate that way. So we stayed on the ship all that day. About noon of the day after we arrived, they began to debark people. It was late in the afternoon before we got off. It takes quite a while to get organized 5,000 people over off a ship.
There's 5,000 on each one of these ships?
Obviously, if it's torpedoed, they go over the side very quickly. But organized, you need to check to make sure that everybody who is supposed to be in your organization is in fact there. If somebody's fallen over the side, you need to know it before you get on dry land. So then during the night, we walked about 6 miles, I guess it was, to the airport outside the city of Oran. Lasina, I believe is the name. I assume it still is their municipal airport. And so that's where we spent then the next month and a half. Although we did send one of our squadrons. Our 3 squadrons were the lowest numbered squadrons in the AAF. Second,
now, what were
fourth,
they
and
flying
fifth.
at this time? They're not flying the Spitfires anymore, so what are they flying now?
Yes, we got
They're still flying the
Spitfires.
Spitfires?
Not only do we have the Spitfires, but we have the British markings on them. The 3 squadrons, QP, WD, and VF, are painted on the side, along with one other letter to designate the individual plane. And then, interestingly, after we left the British Isles, they gave those designations to another group, the 4th Fighter Group, made up mostly of the Eagle pilots, which was a little bit confusing later on in the war when there were a few shuttle missions between England, or actually France at that time, and Italy, where we were stationed. So we had two groups in the air with the same markings. that didn't happen very many times, however.
Yeah, quite confusing.
Yep.
Um, how long, now you were in Africa for a month and a half?
Oh, no, we stayed till the end of the African campaign.
Which was?
As I say, we sent one squadron up forward, actually up to a city in Algeria near Tunisia called Bone, and so they got their first combat victories up there, quite a number of them actually. It was a fairly hot corner up near the front line. Of course, North Africa was 2 campaigns. The first one was the invasion. That only lasted 3 days. It was a case of our going in there not knowing whether the French were going to shoot at us, welcome us, or ignore us. And the answer is all of the above. Some did one, some did another. So it was a very short campaign. There were some losses, but not a large number.
Now you said in North Africa is where you did some of your best scrounging?
Yes, because the New Year's Day, we made our first move of the entire group to the east. We went up about 70 or 80 miles, I think, along the coast to a place that changed, had a French name at the time, and then they changed it later on to an Arab name. I know it's one that's sitting right on an earthquake fault, because I read in the paper where it's gotten shooken apart a couple of times since we were there. Well, we spent a short time there, and then we continued to move to the east. And from there on, we were going forward to forward strips, and sometimes moving back, and sometimes getting chased back. At the time that Rommel went through the Kasserine Pass, we had just moved some of our airplanes and some of our people up to a forward strip, a place called Talep. And during the night when we were up there, just an open field is all it was. I don't believe we'd even had time to put up tents when the Germans started lobbing their 88s over the airfield. So the next morning we loaded up the trucks at daylight, and just as soon as it was decent, we got our planes out, and everybody else got on those trucks and got out back over the mountain. Now that was in Tunisia. That was our first move into Tunisia. And we came back over the mountain, hoped that our army would stop the Germans before they got to our next strip, otherwise we would have been chasing out of there. Back to Aix-les-Bains. Aix-les-Bains was a famous watering spot in the days of Cleopatra, because there were, Aix-les-Bains of course means water, and there were hot springs there. In fact, there were bathing tanks that had been there for 1,000 or 2 years, and that's where Cleopatra took her bath, according to the locals anyway.
Okay, you say on here too you've received a Bronze Star. Can you tell us how that came about?
Well, actually that was at the end of the war, and it was sort of the composite of the various things that I did.
Okay.
Now, when we were at Aix-les-Bains, that was the only time that we and this other fighter group, the 31st, with Spitfires, were on the same base. And that was
ones
because,
with the same numbers? The ones with the same numbers?
No, this was the first of the groups that went overseas that got the British Spitfires.
Okay.
Actually, they had been at Selfridge Field when we were. And so, in fact, some of our people were spawned from the 31st and from the 1st Fighter Group, that other one that I mentioned a little bit earlier, some of the cadres. No, they were sort of our competitors, sort of like Michigan, Ohio State. So we were always looking to see what their score was, and they were looking to see what our score was of confirmed aerial victories. Because that was the one thing that we had the record of. Other things were pretty nebulous, like targets on the ground destroyed and so on. They're hard to count. But confirmed aerial victories, every group kept a record as they crept up there. No, they were there and we were there.
So what was the typical day like here? Were you living in tents? Was there any kind of housing? How were your meals fixed?
Yes, we were living in tents throughout North Africa.
Okay.
Some places, such as Euclideans, we actually were in tents over holes in the ground, where we actually dug down, maybe that 3 feet or so, to be down there in case, well, somebody wants to drop a bomb at night. Well, maybe we can sleep through it if we're down there. As a matter of fact, the Germans came over almost every night while we were there with a Ju-88. They'd drop flares to see what airplanes were on the field, but we got a few bombs, but not very many. In fact, I was never in a very significant bombing. A few around here and there, but not a blanket bombing to be a real problem. Well, one of the things, the one that I said where I almost got caught at it, was there where we finally got orders that because the Germans are retreating, we'll move back to our base, which was a few miles back to the west. And so most of our planes took off, all except several that needed some maintenance work. And one of ours had some instrument problems. The instrument panel in front of the pilot, a couple of the instruments were out. And so my problem was to find replacements if I could. Well, the 31st had nosed up one of their planes and broken up the propeller. So I said, well, obviously they're not going to go anywhere for a while, and there wasn't anybody around there. So I said, let's help ourselves to the instrument panel, which we did, and I put it on our plane, and they took off, fat, dumb, and happy. The maintenance officer from the 31st came over and said, somebody from your outfit stole a part off one of our airplanes. Oh, I can't believe that one of our people would do that. Morally, we wouldn't pull a thing like that. He said, well, you can come and check for yourself if you want to. And we just had a truck that drove all night back somewhere to pick up a new propeller so that we could get this plane out of here. Well, as we stood there talking, there were 2 planes down on the field, one at each end of the strip. One of ours and one of theirs. We had no operations control at that time. They'd already moved out. And so these planes were just individually getting ready to take off to fly back to where the rest of the groups were stationed. Now, the Spitfire had one major problem on the ground. You couldn't see straight ahead until you got the tail up. So that you got some visibility. You could see the sides, and so when they took off down the runway, they operated by the edge of the runway and trusted that it was clear ahead. So these 2 planes came bang as they locked wings, tore the wing off one of them rolled. Neither pilot was killed, but both of them were out of the war. I don't think they ever got back to flying again. They were seriously hurt. So I said to the man I was talking with, well, there's your spare instrument panel. Be my guest. That took care of that.
So you stayed in Africa then till the end of the war, or did you get to rotate home before the war ended?
Not the end of the war, the end of the war in Africa.
Right. Well, now, did were you on the rotation with enough points or whatever to go home? When were you able to get
I'll get to that in just a moment. Where we were in North Africa, from that point on, fairly soon, actually a month later, we moved into that strip that we gotten chased out of, and then we continued. Our next moves were all forward until we were quite far up toward Tunis when the war in North Africa ended.
When was that?
So
what date was that? What time period?
That was in May of 1943.
43?
When the Germans surrendered. Of course, Rommel and some of his people had gotten out of North Africa. They didn't catch him. But there had been a lot of, as I say, a lot of activity not being a pilot, I'm not in the best position to talk about it. And actually, if I tried to go into much detail on that, we'd be here all day. But anyway, the war ended there, and our group by that time had accrued a little over 100 confirmed victories.
Wow.
We'd had quite a few losses. I don't know the exact number. I think it was something like 40, some of whom were prisoners of war, and the rest were killed.
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, we did lose some very fine pilots. But we next were assigned to a strip. Actually, it was simply a wheat field where they just cut the grain off up near Tunis, and waited for the next move, which was obviously Sicily.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as Sicily was taken, we of course would move into an airfield there, staying fairly close to the forward troops.
Mm-hmm.
So we were in at that location for about 3 months, and then we got the word to move on. Now, while I was there, I was transferred into the headquarters, so I was no longer a squadron supply officer. I was what they call the assistant S4. S4 standing for supply.
Okay.
S1 is personnel, S2
Mm-hmm.
intelligence, S3 operations, S4 support,
Mm-hmm.
supply. So I was now in a position where maybe I'd get promoted from, I was the first lieutenant at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I got my first lieutenancy the day after I was married. I didn't mention that
Ah.
on Easter Sunday.
Uh-huh.
But I was kind of stymied in the job I was in because you got promoted those days according to the job you held.
Mm-hmm.
And the squadron supply officer was a first lieutenant. So going into the headquarters, I had a chance to be promoted to captain, which I was when we went into Sicily.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then we moved over to Sicily. That time, we moved with a little different type of transportation. The LST, the landing ship tank, had come into being. They used them, I think, for about the first time on the invasion of Sicily. Now, that's a fairly sizable ship, easy to build. It's a double-decker, has an elevator to take vehicles from the lower deck up to the upper deck, and the front has a drop cargo door that comes down so it can drop on the beach,
Mm-hmm.
and vehicles can drive in and out that way.
Okay, so that's
And-
what you used
and
to
so
get to
that's-
Sicily.
Yeah, they gave us 3 of those to take our 3 squadrons.
Now,
over.
did the planes fly over?
The planes, of course, in every move where we had the planes,
The planes
they
flew.
went over.
Okay.
I didn't mention earlier, as I should have, that our planes, our pilots with their planes actually came into North Africa from Gibraltar.
Hmm.
The pilots went by ship to Gibraltar, and British technicians were uncrating new Spitfires there and assembling them for the pilots of our 2 groups, the 52nd and the 31st. And then at the tail end of the invasion, actually, the first of them flew into North Africa, and the rest of them in the next few days after that.
Mhm.
So that's where we got the planes
Okay.
that we flew through the rest of our Spitfire days.
Now, how long were you in Sicily?
Now, we were in Sicily just about 6 months.
Okay.
And then we got the word to move to Corsica,
Mm-hmm.
which was, we weren't too happy about. Sicily was the nicest place that we lived.
Was it? Now, you had regular housing there versus tents?
Actually, we were right on the municipal flying patch at Palermo, which is the capital of Sicily, on the north side.
Mm-hmm.
How you doing here?
Just fine.
I was just wondering how our time was doing.
Yeah.
You need to get up and let me sit
So,
down, and you need to go to phone.
my office actually was in the civilian operations building,
Mm-hmm.
right on the flying field. And then
She's bringing her price up.
our headquarters officers lived in a villa up at the top of a mini mountain, really. Quite a climb to get up there, up through a lemon grove. But when we got up there, it was very nice. We liberated it from a fascista who had gotten out of there a little ahead of the Allies. And as I say, it was a nice place to live. We had quite a few visitors there. I remember one day I came up from work and there was a visitor. Okay, I'll wait till you get going again. One day I came up there was a visitor, and somebody introduced me to him, but I didn't catch his name. He was kind of old, middle ages, kind of fairly heavy, quite a large man. It wasn't until we were halfway through dinner that I caught on to the fact it was John Steinbeck who was having dinner with us. And he was very interesting to listen to, but after dinner he insisted on going back down the hill and spend his evening with our enlisted men who were living down near the flying patch. And so they sat around and talked. I didn't hear that part of it, but I understand it was very interesting, and he just kind of rambled on, and finally about midnight or so, most of them, knowing they had to work the next day, decided they'd better go to bed. And so he said, well, okay, maybe I'd better. And they said, well, we'll find a bed for you. He said, oh, no, just give me a blanket. And he rolled up on the cement floor and slept all night, took off the next day. Another interesting one there was one day I had, excuse me, a couple of sergeants who worked for me, and one of them came up and said, hey, old Blood and Guts is downstairs. He is. Yep. Has he got his ivory-handled pistols on? Oh, yes. Well, this I've got to see. So I had seen General Patton once before in North Africa, but I made a point of going down to see what he's up to. He's just kind of pacing back and forth out in front of Operations Building. He not only had his pistols on, but he had his swagger stick, and he's going along like this. I saluted him, of course, and he saluted back with a swagger stick. We didn't talk. He didn't volunteer, and I didn't. It wasn't long, though, 30 minutes later maybe, a plane came in, an Italian small cargo plane, and it had the markings on the wings, the white markings, that later were used in connection with the across the channel invasion by our people for identification. If any movies you see of airplanes at that time, you'll see those white stripes. And I suspect that this was the first time that they were actually used for identification so that our people wouldn't shoot them down. Mm-hmm. Well, obviously it was the surrender party from Italy, probably the Prime Minister coming over, because General Patton and his staff car drove out to the plane, picked up a couple of people, and they drove off to town. We didn't get a good look at who was on the plane, but I'm certain that that's what it was, because like 2 days later, the Italians surrendered.
Wow.
Okay.
So they surrendered. It was kind of funny, the night of the surrender. Here we've defeated the Italians, and all this celebration going on, all of it by the Italians. As far as we were concerned, it was just another day in the war.
Wow.
We didn't celebrate because we were still doing the same thing as we had been doing. We did have, at that time, a number of Italian PWs who were working for us in the mess, which meant that there was no KP required anymore for our people. In fact, that went on to the end of the war. The only difference was that after the Italians surrendered, we then were authorized to pay them something like 50 or 60 cents a day. Mm-hmm. And so they were very happy to stay on there, because most of them had families up in the north part of Italy where they couldn't get to anyhow, and they stayed with us, most of them, right up to the end of the war, and were very helpful. Well, when the word came to move forward, our pilots, of course, flew the Spitfires, and we got 3 LSTs to load, which we did, and then somehow we'd expanded on what we'd had when we moved over to Sicily, and we had about 20 vehicles left over that we couldn't get on those LSTs. So somebody would have to stay behind, and I was the one that was picked. Of the 2 of us, the S4 and the assistant S4, we made a practice of one of us would be at the head of the move and one at the tail. Well, that time I was at the tail of the move. So I stayed behind with the 20 vehicles and 20 drivers to wait for the next LST going to Corsica. About that time, the Germans started to act up out in what is the Tyrrhenian Sea. It's part of the Mediterranean between the islands and Italy. And so there was a delay in getting transportation for me and my little group. So we just sat there and enjoyed life. Did a little sightseeing, climbed a couple of little mountains, one thing and another. I did have one interesting thing occur. It was actually a few days after Thanksgiving. I got a call from the quartermaster in Palermo, downtown. He said, "I've got the holiday rations for your people, all the people in Corsica, if you can figure out some way to get them up there. They're frozen, so they're going to have to go by air. Well, I'll see what I can do." So I went into Palermo and hunted up the head of the air transport unit, a brigadier general whom I knew slightly, and said, I figured out that we had 44,000 pounds of frozen this, that, and the other. Most of it was turkey. There was some hamburger, there were some pork chops, there was some butter, a few other goodies. That we'd better have about 11 Goonie birds, C-47s, to get it up there because they're going to have to fly up and back without refueling. There's not too much gasoline up on the island. And he said, yes, you can have them provided you'll find some fighter escorts for them because it's up in a combat zone. After all, Corsica's up here, and the Germans were on France and Italy on 3 sides of us. Okay. In fact, from up where we were, our base up there, we could see Elba, where Napoleon spent some time, and the Germans were on Elba. In other words, we could see the enemy across the pond. So all I had to do was send a teletype up to our people and tell them, send some planes down and some food will come back, and no problem getting that taken care of. So we got 11 of them in one evening, and half the night my group spent hauling the stuff out and loading the airplanes. The next morning the Spitfires came down and they all took off together, so they got their rations. So it was actually New Year's Eve that we finally got a ship to take me and my 20 vehicles and drivers up there. So we got them on an LST along with some other people's stuff, and they took off on New Year's Eve in the midst of a storm. I suppose they thought it was a good idea to be in the storm because the danger from a submarine would be a lot less. But they didn't judge the degree of storm that we were getting into. We were sitting there at dinner, and they had a turkey dinner for us, real special. And we're about halfway through when we got beyond the breakwater, and suddenly our LST, and by the way, that does not have a keel, so it slides all over the ocean. So it was up this way, and it was up this way, and our dinners were in our laps.
Oh my, oh my.
For the next 3 days, it was this way and it was this way. And as the rollers came under it, the side panels on this LST would push out and come back. And so about once a minute, well, there'd be suddenly a real kerbang, like hitting it with a huge sledgehammer. I went to the skipper and said, what in the world is going on? And he explained it. I said, well, isn't that going to fatigue the metal and break us in two? He said, eventually. I said, have you any idea how long? And he said, no, but we may find out. Do you have any good suggestions? He said, just one. Experience has shown that when the LST breaks in two, and a few of them have, that the stern tends to stay afloat longer than the bow. So it's probably a good idea to stay in the back half. Great. Well, it didn't break in two in 3 days, so I guess it must take 4 or 5. By that time we were in the straits, I think Bonifacio, I think is the name of them, between Corsica and Sardinia, and then got around to Ajaccio, where Napoleon was born, and offloaded, headed for our base, which was on the other side and on the far corner of the island, which meant up over a high range of mountains. So we lined up our 20 vehicles and headed down through the lemon grove. It's mild enough weather there that they have lemons. Lemons, it seems, will grow further north than oranges. The trees were still loaded with lemons. They hadn't picked them yet. This was, about the 4th of January, I think. Well, a roadblock, British roadblock, stopped us. And they said, put on your chains. You've got to have chains from here on. Well, fortunately, we had chains buried somewhere in each of the vehicles. We never used them before. Mm-hmm. We put them on. Pretty soon we found out why. As we climbed the mountain, we got into the snow. Yeah. By the time we were halfway up the mountain, the snow was higher than the vehicles, and pushed out on the side.
I didn't think they had snow there.
Pardon?
I didn't realize they had snow there.
Well, it's just at altitude.
Okay.
We finally got to the top, down the other side. We were happy to get back with the group, but they were flying coastal patrol there, protecting quite a lot of things. Mm-hmm. For example, on one occasion they intercepted a flight of Germans headed south to attack Naples. Well, we were far enough north that they're hitting those bombers at that point, forced them to jettison their bombs, and they shot down, 4 or 5 of them, something like that, and the rest of them ran away. The Anzio bridgehead was in progress at the time, and we were furnishing cover for that. In fact, I think on 3 different occasions we were alerted for an evacuation of the bridgehead at Anzio. It was that close an operation, although they managed to cling there until finally they connected up with the forces from the south. Well, in the early spring of '44, we got word that we would convert to the P-51 Mustang, transfer to the 15th Air Force, which is the Strategic Air Force from the south, and move over to Italy, and give our Spitfires back to the British. And so that's what happened. And irony, one thing that happened, we moved away from Borgo was the name of the base where we were, near the fairly large city of Bastia, the largest city, I think, on the island, moved south and inland to convert over to the P-51s while we were waiting for the move over to Italy. Mm-hmm. And the night after we moved out, we never had a bombing raid while we were there. The Germans came over, dropped some flares, saw that there was nobody on the base, and headed south. And about 50 miles south, they came to another airfield by the name of Ghisonaccia, where B-25s were stationed, dropped the flares, saw there were airplanes, and then bombed the heck out of it. So we missed a heavy bomber by 24 hours.
We sure did. Okay, we've got 2 more minutes.
Okay.
In summary.
All right. Well, really, to summarize, actually the most significant part of our group's overseas activities took place after we went into Italy, because then our P-51s began escorting our bombers up into Central Europe and continued that way to the end of the war, and ended up with a combat record of 421 1/3 confirmed aerial victories, plus a great many probables and damage and ground targets and that sort of thing. We stayed on one base on the east side of Italy during that period, and built up a fairly comfortable facility. And when the war ended, we had to wait a while to come back to the States, had to wait for transportation. Our planes were turned in, our pilots were turned back, the rest of us waited for transportation out of Naples. When it finally came, interestingly enough, it was that same ship that we had been on when we went from Scotland over to Ireland. It was the Manhattan, except that it had burned at sea on the way back, rebuilt it into a troop ship, gave it another name. That's the one that took us home, and that ended it.
What a story. Thank you so much.
Happy to do it.